For me, there are two aspects of a watch. There is the mechanical side of it, i.e., if you like the engineering aspect of it, and then there's the aesthetics side of it. And in fact, if you can get both the aesthetics and the mechanical side working together, it's great. But it's what causes a person to go, I like that watch, and more important, I'm willing to pay for that.
That was Mishal Kanoo, an art and watch collector, talking about his view on what makes the watch a work of art. This is episode 1 of Sounds of a Gong. I'm your host, Dominique Mahoney, and hopefully I'll be welcoming more voices like Mishal Kanoo's and anyone really that kind of can give their input on what makes the watch beyond a function of telling time and what gives it this deeper cultural meaning that we're seeing more and more. Episode 1 will be 3 parts: the watch as a mediated art object, the next big thing, and independent watchmaking versus commercial watchmaking. Now, for part 1, we're going to go into 3 significant media events where watches play this significant role. We're going to have more voices like Mishal Kanoo's weigh in on their not just expertise, but their subjective views on what makes watches into art objects based on their different professions. I think it's going to be quite interesting because we're going to have this 360 view. Why should we even care about watches unless we buy them or we work in the industry? Let's find out. But first, a little bit more about me. I worked in the watch industry for almost 8 years. And depending on who you asked, I played a variety of different roles. On paper, I was a marketing manager responsible for holding different events and programs that engaged the public, organizing open discussions on how the industry worked on the inside. And you can probably see why this posed an oxymoronic kind of task, because this is an industry that its success hinges on appearing perfect. There were several ways that I organized my talks to be more about the art of discussion rather than about marketing a certain brand or trying to make a figurehead of a company look good. And it was by implementing certain rules where, we chose the speakers, and no matter who you were, you could be the CEO of whatever watch brand or whatever jewelry brand, and it wouldn't matter. If we don't choose you to be part of the forum, then you are not going to partake. And so no corruption was to go on, and the topics would be chosen by us, and the speakers could either take it or leave it. And I got up there and did intros, making sure that the speakers stuck to the actual panel discussion, because sometimes in these industry talks, the speakers tend to go rogue and talk about things that they just only want to talk about, namely promote their own brand or their own, name. A pit bull. I've been called Jerry Springer and a number of things. But as I said, on paper, I was just a marketing manager. Let's talk about 3 different media events that made major headlines and international news, with watches playing a central role. In May 2021, a man was assaulted in a Beverly Hills restaurant for his watch. He was stalked and targeted in this highly sophisticated attack. You have to have had specialized knowledge to be able to recognize a watch like the one the victim was wearing, a Richard Mille. That was the brand name. And that event signified that the level of sophistication in crime, in changing in accordance with updated technologies and access to information, as well as it being harder to simply go and rob a bank. Criminals becoming watch connoisseurs, even as a consequence rather than an intention, was a statement in itself on how society is evolving and adapting. The second media event is when Mark Zuckerberg announced the end of Meta fact-checking, wearing $1 million watch. Now, the fact that he wore this watch out in public while making such an important historical announcement in itself was crazy. The headlines read literally that Mark Zuckerberg announces the end of Meta fact-checking wearing $1 million watch. And the outpour of curiosity was just astounding. And the public just went on this search for wanting to know more, to kind of understand why and what was going on with the change of this former low-key tech bro's habits to now being this watch connoisseur that we then saw unfold over social media, with different users putting up images of Mark Zuckerberg wearing a Rolex here and a special Cartier there, and all of a sudden his entire persona changed almost overnight, all from wearing this one watch. And it's not even by a well-known brand, it's by a very artisanal niche watch brand called Groupe Forcé, who are specialized in mechanical engineering. And here we have this innovative member of society who decides how society functions, and all of a sudden he's wearing this mechanical watch instead of a smartwatch. What does that do? What cultural impact does it have on the people watching? It's a question that we found ourselves asking when Mark Zuckerberg wore a watch. Finally, the third instance where watches symbolized more than simply a function for telling time is when male actor Timothée Chalamet was photographed wearing a visibly feminine watch called the Cartier Crash. Now, this is a watch specifically made for women. The actor wearing this exceptionally feminine watch raised discussions on masculinity versus femininity and the stereotypes and the gender norms on what's supposed to look masculine, what's supposed to look feminine, and not only accepted but celebrated by society, resulting in these watches to be sold out everywhere. It was this shattering of stereotypes and establishing one's own version of style or masculinity, whatever it is, that seemed to create this far deeper meaning that made this watch all of a sudden the most desired object to be owned and had. These watches at the center of these rather important media events symbolize that deeper meaning that society seems to constantly be on the lookout for, seeking knowledge to find its deeper meaning of what it's worth and its value, or what other people find it worth. That driving force, that need to understand, is far more powerful than any marketing tool or financial incentive, where money is not the means to an end, but rather the knowledge is. Watchmaster Dr. Rebecca Struthers tells her perspective on what makes a watch meaningful and into an art object.
Watches have that added advantage of being something that you carry around on your person, and that was really important from their advent. So over 500 years ago, because you had clocks around, you had domestic clocks around, but that wasn't something you could carry around to show people in your daily life. You couldn't use it to express your personal style or your culture or your education or just your preferences, your wealth, your status. Whereas watches allowed for that. So they kind of became this portable work of art that you could take around with you. And I think that also adds to the richness that they bring in terms of becoming so much more than an object, because they become a story that they develop. They kind of develop this narrative with their owner. It's like every mark, every scratch that watch picks up is part of that story of its relationship with its owner. And that can form these really deep sentimental bonds. And then when you layer that as well with it being time, and time being this incredibly, arguably the most important element that any of us have, and that linking to memory as well. So then you get kind of inherited pieces from family collections. You kind of got this incredibly beautiful work of art already, or mechanical art, or even on the cheap and cheerful side, you're still building up this, it's more than an object. So when you combine that with the very finest in high horology, with the state-of-the-art mechanical watchmaking, or beautiful, incredible design, or gem setting, like what we're seeing now with these kind of watching the awards ceremony recently. Obviously, I'm sure you've been following this with their jewelry watches being worn by men as well. But it's incredible. They are these works of art that just accentuate an outfit and a look and a style. And it's just, it's all kind of feeds into that narrative. I think that kind of it's a wearable work of art.
Dr. Rebecca Struthers is an independent watchmaker. She creates all her watches herself by hand with her husband. They make up a watchmaking duo. In terms of artistry, you could say that they are the true artists in the watch world because they create everything by hand, by human hand, if you measure art by human touch, which some people do hold that standard. A standard that is used in the watch marketplace among not just watch masters themselves, but independent watch brands and commercial watch brands. We have here on Sounds of a Gong, Edouard Meylan, the CEO of an independent watch brand, meaning that it's purely their vision that drives the company. He talks about why the notion of the solitary artist or the watchmaker and why that holds so much meaning that translates into value in the watch marketplace.
This is an influence of marketing. As you know, we put a lot of value on manufacturers and the integration of manufacturers. And I think way too many, especially the groups, and put way too many brands put focus on we integrated and value on the fact that they integrated, they do everything themselves. They hide a lot from the reality from the customers because they believe the value is on the fact that they master all aspects of the production. Whereas we all know that we are an ecosystem and this industry is based on multitude of suppliers. It's always been like this. I mean, if we look at it even before the quartz crisis we're taking, I think the mass majority of the companies working in the watch industry were tiny companies with a handful of people working. One were doing some gears, some were doing some stones, were doing the hands, some doing the, and it was actually the combination of all those craftsmen that made a watch. But then suddenly came the era of manufacture, and we kind of started hiding the reality of our business because we started marketing manufacturers and integration as like the highest level of mastery. It's kind of the benchmark now is you need, if you want to be in the high end luxury and therefore create true art watches, art pieces, you need to be a manufacturer. You need to master the different arts. You cannot be outsourcing anything. Otherwise it's not your art piece anymore. And that's why I feel people are, because customers are biased and brands are pushing, I think in a very fake way, it's a bit of an omerta, if the fact that they are manufacturers, people put way too much value on that, and therefore everybody is kind of incentivized to hide what they don't do, and therefore they put forward the integration rather than the vast number of amazing people that actually contribute to making all their watches.
There are two sides of what makes an object meaningful. There's the side that creates that object and the meaningfulness and art or art intention that's poured into it while creating it. And then there's the interpretation on the other side and how much of that is really seen and felt. According to Edouard, there's a lot of falsehoods or intentions of trying to look like a master when in fact the watch brand has not mastered that craft and has not created that piece entirely by themselves. And there's a lot of manipulation and marketing and tactics in order to make the audiences feel that this piece is perhaps maybe more meaningful than it actually is. Edouard Meylan mentions the quartz crisis of the 70s. Now, this is when the battery-powered watch was invented, so there was actually no virtual functional need to make these expensive mechanical watches, and a lot of engineering and knowledge and know-how went into inventing these mechanisms inside the watch, all to be as precise as possible, and that was the selling point of the watches up until the quartz crisis when batteries just did the job. It meant that watches ultimately, as mechanical objects telling time, were no longer needed, which is why the integration and the company or brand or watchmaker became under this pressure to kind of look like a master in every sense. And you can kind of only really be a master if it's you doing all the work. That's where collaborations come in, and then it becomes about, as Howard Becker of the art world's theory says, the artist's vision and keeping that vision intact and putting more value on the relationships surrounding the creation of this watch. Keeping that in mind, Edouard now talks about Rolex and how Rolex symbolically became something more than it originally was intended by the founder, despite being a commercial watch brand that produces millions of watches a year.
You know, when you look at Rolex, now Rolex is like this kind of, for many people, a grail that, you know, it's like this thing that when you achieve, you made it in life, you need to wear a Rolex. I don't know if it answers your question, but originally the objective of Mr. Wildorf was to say that his objective was to put a Rolex on everybody's wrist. Why? Because at that time it was a tool, it was something useful, and therefore he wanted to make it available to everyone. And then suddenly what Rolex was not a luxury product, and it has been, we made it a luxury product as a society. And I think today that's kind of where we're going. I think we all know that we don't need watches anymore. Therefore, they are products that are pure emotion, enjoyment. And in the watch industry, we're creating fewer and fewer and making them more and more expensive in a way. Because we realize that there's maybe too much competition from other type of products like smartwatches, like made in whatever country watches. Mm-hmm. And we have no choice but to go up, and therefore going more towards like this luxury art pieces, and then displaying them as such.
For me, I was always in awe. Like, there were people who bought these watches not to wear, but to have a few friends over and to bring out, you know, a box from a safe and to pass the watches around in a small setting, and people talk about it, hold it in their hand, put it on their wrist. Party's over, watches go back in the safe.
That was luxury lawyer Ghada Audi, whose job was to protect the authenticity of the watches and the reputation of the brand and what made it a entity worth respecting in terms of prestige, which contributed to the longevity of the brand. She had access to these watch collectors who had such precious pieces that, as you just heard her say, they would not even bring them out unless it was their ultimate close friends or someone special or treasured that they would come and show the watch to in this very intimate, almost ceremonial process. We are reaching a happy end to part 1 of episode 1. Dr. Suzanne Scheld, anthropologist and cultural studier of human behavior, makes sense of everything we've just heard.
What cultural norms went into shaping these values and escalating the values such that a very expensive watch is the sign of beauty. People talk about art, they like art, but also our society doesn't invest a lot in art. You know, like wealthy people invest in their art, but it's like a society collectively, I don't think it values art the way it could as we, cut our art education programs in schools off at the knees, right? Like our kids are lucky today to have a class in the arts, because it's not considered to be so important anymore.
Dr. Scheld touches on a very important aspect in terms of how society views watches, if at all, and why this concept of mastery is reserved for a select few. The arts appear and are treated as a privilege that one can only embrace if they can afford it. Tatum Dooley, an art writer, describes behavior and attitude towards art with this example using Reddit.
We've seen a lot of viral stories in the last few years that like somebody has found, a Tom Thompson at a garage sale or a famous, Renaissance bust at a flea market, and they've bought it and then they've realized, oh, what I bought for $5 is actually worth maybe $1 million, maybe $200,000, but a life-changing amount of money. And this idea that art holds this value, and it takes kind of that educational awareness of what is worth value and what isn't. Somebody could look at it and say that's junk, that's not a very good painting. But if somebody knows maybe their art history or they had an aesthetic connection to it, it can turn out that this piece was worth a lot more money than they paid. And then, during these times, such economic hardships, I think it becomes very lucrative, or, this idea of like a daydream where you could be that person that finds the artwork and your life changes. But the reality really is that most art does not hold that value. So I really saw that subreddit as this glimpse into, like, I don't want to say the desperation, but like the hopes and the dreams of people and how they associate artworks with that. And then how often you're also seeing those dreams kind of get crushed with people commenting like, no, this is worth $5. This is worth nothing. So you're really seeing like a very transparent look into how people view art.
One of the ways to view art is to kind of understand one's place in this world, or in their universe, or in their community, or in their whatever context they're in, and to just have this tangible or visual symbol of it. Dr. Rebecca Struthers leaves us with quite a beautiful quote.
That's an important part of our identity, is understanding where we are within the context of our industry as a whole. And this idea that we are just part of something that has been around for hundreds of years and will continue to be around for hundreds of years, and that you're making these objects that, if are well looked after, will live on for centuries after we're dead and gone.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode and hope to see you again pretty soon. Welcome to part 2 of episode 1 of Sounds of a Gong. We're going to be discussing the phenomenon of the next big thing. So we've already talked about watches as art objects and what makes them meaningful on a personal and subjective level, and how they're marketed as such to the individual. But what happens when a watch becomes meaningful not only to one person or two or three, but what happens when that number multiplies so that meaning translates into value? Tania Edwards, an expert in marketing Patek Philippe watches, she was part of the global campaign, "You never own a Patek, you merely look after it for the next generation." Now, this campaign has lasted for decades and is what shaped Patek Philippe and their brand message and their brand's mission statement, and continues to shape it. And Tania was the integral part of that. Currently, she's now a vintage Patek Philippe expert, and her job is basically to spread knowledge. So after a 30-plus career in marketing, she's now focusing on the knowledge side of watches and really appreciating them as the works of art that they're intended to be. Let's hear a bit from Tania on this phenomenon that makes a watch into the next big thing in the marketplace.
Why does something become hugely successful and hugely important, or must have a hot watch or whatever it is? Why does that happen? If I could answer I would have been able to have retired years ago. I mean, there's what makes a market. It's lots and lots of different things make a market, and but a lot of it has got to do with people agreeing on something and a mass starting that says this is what should be. And I'll give an example of that. So Patek makes a timepiece called the Nautilus, which is a sports watch, a steel sports watch. It came out in the 1980s. It's been around, since then for quite a while. And during COVID, when a lot of things changed during COVID, because people had time to sit and learn and research, I don't know why, but this snowball started of saying that the Nautilus was the watch that people should buy. And it sort of came out from, where did it come from? I don't know where it came from. It just started. And it grew and grew and grew. And then suddenly the Nautilus was the watch that everybody should have in their, that's the watch they should own. And I to this day, I find it shocking. I mean, the call I had before you was with a new client who said, well, I think I better get a Nautilus. And I was like, why do you think you better get a Nautilus? Oh, because that's the watch to have. And I'm thinking, there's so many other watches to have. You don't need that. But they think they should because that's the one that everybody knows. Do you see what I mean? And so that's the market driving that. That's this unknown that you can't put in a bottle and identify easily. Otherwise, that's what everyone's looking for. What is it that makes something a must-have, desirable? And it's just this accumulation, isn't it, of more and more people talking about something, saying it's right, saying it's the best, saying it's the coolest, saying it's whatever. Even if it's not in real life, even if you don't think it is particularly. It was a watch that Patek found very difficult to sell when it first came out. I was working at the company when we found it hard to sell that timepiece. People didn't want it. And then it becomes the hottest thing in the whole watch industry. How did that happen? I don't know how it happened.
It's quite admirable listening to her because entire departments are dedicated, like their salaries depend on being able to go to whoever's paying off that salary and being able to say, I can figure that out. That's just kind of the marketer's unique selling point, being able to tell an employer that, I can sell this for you so that everyone is vying for it. But Tania tells it more like it is, that, that's part of the thing that makes an art object, that is that you can't bottle it up. You can't figure out the right ingredients. That just doesn't exist. Sure, you can come up with a meme that goes viral for, so many hours, or there could be a fashion trend like piercing, your forehead. But when it comes to actually coming up with this thing that everyone has to own and lasts for years and years and years, that's just something you can't predict. It's something that just really has to organically happen. So I did kind of really appreciate what she had to say about that. And it's that honesty, that acknowledgement that there is a certain element that's out of our control. We can't make everything that can feel quite relieving. Anyways, on the other hand, watch collector Mishal Kanoo has a different theory from the perspective of the buyer's end, and therefore the person with the means and the option of taking part, whether it's the Patek Philippe Nautilus or other examples that you're about to hear.
Most people who buy the Nautilus, not all, because I put a small section of the people who actually buy Nautilus, who really like the watch, like the design. I'll put them aside because they're the rare ones. Most people who buy a Nautilus, sadly, buy it because, well, what's it called? FOMO, fear of missing out. So this, by the way, this is a disease created by bankers. Gotta love them. So the bankers would buy, for some reason, it became the in thing to buy a Rolex Daytona. So you wanted to have a Daytona. So, everyone wanted to get a Daytona. So if you got a Daytona, and not the gold one, but the steel one, because it was even harder to get, it's like saying, look at me, I can afford, I can get. And so it's a status symbol. Look at me, I'm fantastic. And those people who couldn't get the Nautilus went, okay. Sorry, couldn't get the Daytona, went, okay, what else is there? And Nautilus became something that popped up. And I went, oh yeah, Patek Philippe is a fantastic brand, which it is. Fantastic history, great history. Is the Nautilus an absolutely fantastic watch? No, it's the complications on it until recently were very limited. But it's a stainless watch that people put on their wrist and say, "Oh, look at me again." So the cycle with what was the Daytona, Rolex Daytona, went to the Nautilus, and then it went to the AP Royal Oak, and now really it's everyone's saying, well, there's so many of them, it's not limited, and you know what? I don't like bankers anymore, so I don't want to have it. But you still have people who say, as a way to show that I've arrived, would want to get one of those watches and put it on his wrist. It's not, as I said, I don't have an issue with the watch itself, because the watch, whether it's the Daytona, whether it's the Nautilus, whether it's the AP Rollo, they're all really, really good watches. Some of them really great watches. But the reason why people purchase them, as I said, the majority, sadly, has nothing to do with them appreciating the watch per se, or appreciating the history of the watch, or appreciating the artist, the stylist who created the watch. No, they just want to make sure that people know, I'm here. I've reached the point. I'm fantastic, and look at me. Well, which is always a sad thing, because eventually somebody will find something else, and everyone moves to that.
When you say that people are like, okay, well, I don't like bankers anymore, is that are you saying, like, who are you talking about exactly, and could you clarify what you mean by that?
They are the ones who set the trend. Okay, most of them, the bankers, are the ones who set the trend regarding what type of watches you're gonna wear. I'm not saying that because necessarily that it's good or bad. I'm not criticizing them. This is a trait, a way to show your customers I'm trustworthy. I know what I'm doing. Look, I'm successful, so therefore, bank with me.
I'm reminded of Glengarry Glen Ross, that film with Alec Baldwin, and Alec Baldwin rolls in with his Rolex and is portraying this image that he kind of wants to sell to his clients so that they buy into whatever he's selling. So the watch industry, I am finding more and more, is quite artistic, but not in the way that they kind of, me included, when I was working in the industry, was intending. There's that trying to look artistic and deep and meaningful, and then there's actually being artistic and deep and meaningful quite unintentionally. And I think that's wrapped up in the next big thing and being the next big thing. It's quite an unintentional, natural thing to just happen. There's no lack of trying to make the next big thing, and there are success stories, especially when there's a kind of obvious gap in the market. And Tania Edwards is now going to talk us through the launching of a new watch from A to Z and how that all works.
You're going to start with a drawing, I would assume, and then a prototype needs to be made, and then the decision is made to go into production. And normally for something like a watch, and I can only talk about mechanical watches, but I would say the same would be if you're just mass producing a quartz watch. You still need to make the machinery to make that movement Well, maybe not in quartz, because a quartz is just a movement. If you're creating a new movement, you're going to have to make new machinery to help you make that movement. You're going to have to train your watchmakers to finish these movement pieces. And this can take, I mean, it can take, I mean, on average, I think it takes at least 2 to 4 years to bring a new timepiece to market, in terms of the creation, the development, and then production. There are timepieces that can take much longer than that. For example, there's a timepiece that took 9 years to make. It took 5 years of development and 4 years of production to make that timepiece, because it was so complicated and difficult to do. So it depends on how complicated something is. And then when it's finished, it needs to be marketed. And when I first started in the industry, the way it was marketed was primarily through retailers, because retailers had the relationship with the end consumer. So the end consumer would come to its trusted jeweler, source, and normally, you know, each town, large town in America, would have a jeweler or a watchmaking store that families had been visiting, and they trusted them, and they would present this new timepiece to the individual. And then obviously there's the traditional marketing, advertising, and branding, and all that sort of thing. So it's a long process. And then whether or not something is successful becomes a very in-demand piece is going to depend on a lot of different things. It's going to depend on whether or not it's appealing to the end consumer straight away, if it's a design that appeals and therefore does become demand, or if the marketing is such that it helps bolster and push that demand. So it's a very long process. And, you know, at the start, for it, be it an independent watchmaker or a large brand, you know, they're taking, every year they bring out new products, because every year they're trying to bring out new things for consumers to buy, as it's the same in the fashion industry or wherever, is new design, and trying to appeal to a new audience. So, for example, Patek in the 1990s, they were very well known as a man's watch, but they weren't so well known as a woman's watch. And they realized that they needed to design a watch that was appealing to women and that was at a price point that would encourage a woman to buy it for herself, which was a very different thing for this high-end luxury item, because normally, like a piece of jewelry or a fine timepiece would have been bought as a gift. Do you see what I mean? So it wouldn't have been bought as something for yourself. Whereas women can buy themselves a handbag, or they can buy themselves a pair of shoes, but they wouldn't buy themselves a watch, a high-end watch, or a piece of jewelry, important piece of jewelry. That's changed now. I think that women would do that, but and so Patek designed a timepiece that it felt very strongly would appeal to women, that would appeal not just because it was a beautiful design, but because it was a practical design. And they came out with something called the 24, which, as its name implies, was a watch that could be worn 24 hours a day, that would go from day, i.e. going to the gym, taking the kids to school, whatever, to going to a cocktail party or a black tie event. So it had to cover everything for a woman. It had to be more practical in a way, which they were right to have thought of that. And it was immediately appealing. And they had it at a price point that was, for a Patek, artificially low, but it was to open up that market. And that combination of a really beautiful design that was practical and at a price of a really attractive price point, that with brilliant marketing that the ad agency did for it. It was this package that was put together to make something successful. But that doesn't always happen. It doesn't always come together as a perfect storm, as we know. So it's always a risk, and it's always a challenge for, be it that independent watchmaker or that huge brand. It's always a risk bringing something new out, but it has to be done.
I guess if you don't follow the mantra money talks and it only means something if it's a success, then you could consider this long, arduous process that Tania Edwards describes as meaningful in itself, including the risk. As she had mentioned earlier, the Nautilus was not a success when it was first launched, so you can't really judge until something unexpected happens. Wrapping up part 2 is Ghada Kaisi, luxury lawyer who has been in the corporate seat, basically acting as a sort of protector of that relationship between client and watch brand or watch retailer. I wanted to get her take from her unique position being in the middle of client and watch brand or seller. It is important to note that her salary was paid by the watch retailer, the luxury distributor selling these watches to clients, but her job was only as good as if the client was happy with the transaction. So in that sense, she had a view of both sides of the transaction of these art objects, and I thought it would be very interesting to hear her take on the next big thing.
How many opportunities did I have to buy a Rolex, and I never bought one? And I think it's very subjective. It's very, individual, but I just said, I don't want something that's still so mass produced, even if there are certain Rolexes that are, impossible to get, even though they're not the most expensive ones to create, right? Stainless steel. They're not platinum, but those are more coveted because of, what ended up happening there. Was it just marketing? Was it just the fact that there was a brand strategy that said, let's make this less, let's just make it harder to get? And now people want it because it's just not accessible.
There you have it. We have wrapped up part 2 of episode 1, The Watch as Art Object. And hearing from these people discuss the next big thing has been quite an experience, at least from my end. So coming up is part 3 of episode 1, The Watch as Art Object. This next part, entitled Independent Watchmaking versus Mass Commercial Production, is going to talk about the difference between an independent watchmaker and watch brand and a commercial watch brand. One is handmade, the other is machine made, but in the end of the day, they market themselves all to be art objects. So hope that you're excited for Welcome to part 3. For this part of the episode, we're going to get into independent watchmaking versus commercial mass production and the difference between the two. And in the end of the day, they both are selling their watches as art objects. We're going to talk about something that's hand produced versus machine made, and what is the artistry that goes into both processes of creation. Mishal Kanoo, avid watch collector who's been collecting for decades, explains the difference, and I'll let him kick us off.
I'll have to split that into two. I'll split that into large watch companies and independent watch companies. And even in the large watch companies, I'll split that into two, because you have the regular watches that you produce, all the entry level or mid level watches, which usually are not that sophisticated, and what for God's sake, my French sucks, but high watchmaking, Uh,
Yeah.
exactly. Which is something that where they go out of the way to create something that is special and unique and very, very limited, very limited. They would qualify for me as to the same degree as with independent watchmakers, except that the ones from large brand names have the money and the ability to do the R&D that is required for this, and the ones who are independent watchmakers usually don't. They have to become more ingenious themselves. They have to find ways to go around to create that piece that's in their mind, take it from their head onto the piece of paper. When you're talking about large brand companies, they're not going to advertise the top-end watches except to their certain select clients. That's going to be whom they're going to go after. And they don't necessarily have to advertise them. What they will do is they have a list of customers that they usually sell to. They'll knock on their door and say, look, we're creating this new thing. We like this. We're doing this new thing. What do you think? Is this appealing to you? And so on. So they get you to salivate for it. And then they tell you, oh, it'll take this long, how long to take. Again, maybe it might be because it actually takes a long time to get it done. The other part is thinking marketing, the more I make you wait, the more you want it. So you have that aspect. The independent watchmaker, on the other hand, doesn't have that luxury. So for him, going through channels like social media, going through word of mouth, going through the events, watchmaking events, where they can showcase their watch and get people excited about it because they can do things that others can't do. That's, I think, the way they will market themselves to get the customer to say, you know what, I like this. And with independent watchmakers, the more you come in early and you continuously buy from them, you don't have to buy everything they have, but that you buy once a year or once every 2 years. That you become a good customer, and then they don't feel you as a customer. They feel you as and appreciate you as a connoisseur of their product, and they feel happy that they're giving you one of their pieces that they worked hard on, and it's going to go to a good home. And they're not giving it to somebody who's going to flip it. At the end of the day, you also have to take into consideration that they are human beings. They have to live. They have to earn money. So sometimes, even if you don't like the person, but he or she has the money, willing to sell it. So it depends on the type of marketing and who you're marketing to and how it's marketed. The channel of marketing would differ depending on whom. So for example, if I'm Cartier, and I have, again, the two levels. I have the horology, and I have the regular watches. The regular watches, I'll be putting it on advertisements. I'll be showcasing it in my window case. I'll be promoting it maybe on billboards, which I find strange, but still, I see them. You would do that because they're saying these are the watches that are worth getting. That's what the idea trying to put in the person's head. And the top-end watches, once I know that you buy enough, or I know that you're a good customer of mine, I'll be the one knocking on your door saying, by the way, come sit, I'll show you. I have these lovely new watches that no one else is going to see. And it's special, and you can have it. And it's always this, it's special just for you, type of thing. It actually, I know this sounds corny, but it works. Because we do want to feel special. And marketing to that ego works.
The difference between an independent watchmaker or watch brand and a commercial watch brand is that the commercial watch brand is that much bigger and has this whole section of entry-level watches that are usually generically designed or designed by a watchmaker from years ago, and then the same model is being kind of produced over and over again per year. And depending on how successful that watch model is, there's a limited number per year. Sometimes it's available, sometimes it's not. But then there's this added level, this next level. And Kanoo refers to this as haute horlogerie, the high watchmaking that commercial watch brands offer, similar to independent watchmakers, where they're these specially designed watches that only a very special client that is usually an established collector who's been loyal and with that company for so many years, or that watchmaker, only they are privy to that watch that is now made available to them personally. And the fact that only they are given that opportunity to buy the watch is a thing in itself. Now, the previously mentioned Nautilus is not considered a special model in any sense. It is now, at this point, it's been around over 30 years, and it is just a reprinted version of the original design that watch designer Gerald Genta scrawled on a napkin or a paper in a restaurant this one day. So that watch designer designed the Nautilus in this restaurant, inspired by the Patek Philippe owner's love for sailboats. So he made the dial of the watch the shape of a ship's window, and that creative moment that he had in the 1970s when he first designed that watch has lasted till now. But you would consider the Patek Philippe Nautilus a commercial watch, or a, as Kanoo says, entry-level watch. And yet it still has a years-long waiting list. So does that make it an art object? Because it's this coveted special watch piece, even if it is a generic design at this point, does it still count as a watch object, just like Andy Warhol's silkscreen prints that were mass-produced and machine-made, like the Nautilus? So that is a question that, the industry faces today. That contemporary version of a conceptual art piece, where it's the history of it and the concept and the social meaning that's been poured into it due to the snowball effect of the level of demand it's accumulated, and kind of its place in history. Like the Nautilus changed the way people wear watches, and that it was designed to be a sporty, everyday watch, when at the time watches were considered these fine objects you only wear to special occasions. So these game-changing concepts, does that make an art piece when it's conceptually artistic, as opposed to physically having this fine art element where it was especially designed, there's a special new inventive way to tell time, it's been engineered masterfully, it's purely handmade, it looks aesthetically a certain way, it has added painted elements in the dial. So can an entry level watch still be considered an art piece? The way you see them up on billboards, does that make them any less of art objects or more? Creatively speaking, the independent watch company or the independent watchmaker has more freedom, and Kanoo says ingenuity to design their watch piece, and because they have to stand out if they want to make money, because they don't have a line of entry-level watches to keep their company funded. Dr. Rebecca Struthers, who's going to tell us about that process and that very special relationship between herself and the client when they are creating a watch a lot of the times together.
I think a really important part of the independent watchmaking scene is that ability that collectors have to meet and speak to their actual watchmaker, that they get to play a part in the creation of their watch. So the story starts before the watch is delivered. And you see that a lot. I think people will fall in love with sometimes the watchmaker more than the watch. It's that relationship, that story they have, their personal journey as well, and how that kind of aligns with the collector's own hopes and aspirations, sort of a thing. So things that mean something to the owner but no one else would understand or interpret is a really special part of that process. And and the relationship you have as well, because you've worked with them sometimes for years. Like some of our watches take years to make, so you kind of build that relationship as you go. And we know all of our clients except one now. Actually, we sold our first watch through a dealer, and so we have one client we don't know, which is a bit weird. But the rest of them, we know personally. We send each other like holiday cards and stuff. It's going well and truly over and above what is even practical in terms of watchmaking to push their skills to their limits. And maybe that's where this has evolved as well. So you've got that division now, because you can produce things the practical way, which is a fully mechanized route, or you can do the really impractical way now, which is the hand skills that is going back to how it used to be done hundreds of years ago. That in itself is a form of artistic craft. Because having done it, I can honestly say it's the least practical way of making a watch in the 21st century. We do it for the love of it and because we love practicing our skills. And I don't think there's any other reason a sane person would do that to themselves. I mean, we're quite firm in that we wouldn't do anything really wacky or out there. We have our style, and I think we're very lucky that the people who come to us understand that and they like our style. So we're already kind of working on the same page. We've had a couple of times where clients have wanted something slightly different. And at first we've been thinking, oh no, this is awful, it's never going to work. But by the time we kind of push through and we put our stylistic influence back into it, and we kind of see where they're coming from, and we bounce a few designs around, you kind of get to a point in the middle where you think, actually, yeah, you know what, this really does work. I didn't think it would, but it does. Like, they saw something that we didn't, and with a bit of tailoring and you know, getting there in the end, which is another important thing to remember, and that we've learned through now experience, is that your collectors aren't usually designers either. So maybe they're not expressing it in the way that you're used to hearing it, and that's why there's a lack of understanding. So it's really important to work through that process, I think, because you find brilliant ideas you'd never have come up with yourself, you know. And innovation is forged through collaboration so many times. It's hard to innovate on your own.
And yet there have been independent watchmakers that have functioned on their own. We'll take Dr. George Daniels as an example, who Dr. Rebecca Struthers talks about as this historical figure and a well-known watchmaker and watch engineer that till this day is celebrated for his mechanical prowess.
In terms of his legacy, I'd say he's one of the greatest sort of rock and roll artist watchmakers that has ever lived. And I don't think people really talk about that side of what he did. I mean, he literally had people who said they wanted a watch, and he would decide whether or not he'd make them a watch based on whether or not he liked them. And if he did like them, he'd just reappear in a year or two's time with a watch and say, well, it's this much money, and they'd just pay for it, and they would get whatever he made for them. You know, so to have that absolute trust and that kind of, so to say arrogance, because that has negative connotations, but to have that self-confidence in your work, to just like, I am making you what I am making you, and you will accept what I do, just feels really strong and more of an artist approach. Like, he let his design and what he wanted to do lead. And the way he said, like, he didn't like you to be able to see the hand in what he made, and yet his watches are some of the most hand finished watches you'll see compared to the modern industry. You can see like the finishing, but it was, yeah, his engineering mind that was just brilliant. And I think that's cool. And I think it's something we perhaps lack a bit now. And I don't know if that's because clients don't have that same kind of trust in people, or it was just a really unique environment that allowed him to thrive. Obviously he married a very affluent woman who no one talks about, and that will help an artist. It helps, you know, to not have to worry about making a living while you're creating. That is a very luxurious position to be in. So yeah, maybe it was just the right coming together. It's kind of that zeitgeist moment. I don't know, but yeah, I don't think he gets enough credit for that kind of avant-garde approach that he took.
Summing up the difference between independent watchmaking and commercial watch brands is the fact that commercial watch brands did start off as independent watch companies that simply were so successful that they were able to commercialize their product or their watch on a mass level. And commercial watch brands like Patek Philippe or Rolex are now considered these cultural institutions that open museums and in positions to fund art programs and huge mass scale events like the Oscars or the Olympics, and to essentially be an integral part of the cultural landscape. Tania Edwards, who has 35 plus years experience working for Patek Philippe on the corporate side, gives us her view.
When I started working with Patek Philippe watches a long time ago, very few people knew what the brand was. And I always used to say, if you see somebody wearing a Patek Philippe, you know they're an interesting person, because they didn't need a status symbol to verify why they were wearing such an expensive timepiece. They knew themselves what they were buying, and they knew exactly the craftsmanship that had gone into making that timepiece and why it cost so much money. So that's very different today, especially for luxury items, that it's that brands are so powerful and meaningful to most people, and they're a status symbol. Whereas I think it's looking at the past is far more interesting as to people bought things because they knew what they were buying, that they understood the craftsmanship, the time, the quality that had gone into making something. You don't just come out of nowhere and be successful. You have to have been practicing your art for a long time, and people have had to start to get to know you and realize that what you're making is really superb, and bought it and told other people about it, and then you start to get awareness. It takes time.
As episode 1, the watch as an art object, comes to a close, perhaps we can consider that after everything we've heard and everything we've learned, that maybe what differentiates a status symbol from an art object, it's that yearning to know more about it and to learn about it and to get to know it. I think that differentiates a luxury item from a work of art and an art object. That kind of thing, zeitgeist, hype, whatever you want to call it, to get people motivated enough to learn about it is what's key. But from what I've seen and heard, doesn't seem like something that can be, as Tania Edwards said, bottled up. Doesn't matter who you are. You could be an independent watchmaker or a commercial watch brand. And so I would like to conclude here that what makes a watch into an art object simply appears to be, from talking to all these professionals and experts and participants in this field and outside of the field, that it's the human relationships around it and the way that society perceives that watch piece or that object, and the way they relate to each other when that watch object is released out into the world. I hope that you enjoyed episode 1 of Sounds of a Gong's The Watch as an Art Object. I want to thank all of our interviewees who joined us today and who put in the time and energy in pouring in their expertise and insight. Without them, this episode kind of wouldn't have happened. I also wanted to take the time to acknowledge Howard S. Becker, renowned sociologist and the scholar behind art worlds theory, which I've kind of found a home for all my thoughts and questions about perhaps one of the most complicated of art worlds, the watch world.